Hello, Emily. Welcome to the Six Comms podcast.
Hi, Lisa. It's really nice to be here.
It's lovely to see you. And you are based in London. I'm guessing it's cold there. Am I right?
Yes, and very, very rainy today. So nice and miserable.
Oh,
Yeah, classic
okay.
British weather.
That's how I remember it. So I'm really excited for you to come on to the podcast today because you have recently released a book called The Path of the Guide, which is very exciting. And it's for facilitators like yourself and myself. And I thought this was a great opportunity to just chat to you about one of my favorite C's of the 6 C's of effective communication, which is connection. So we've called this episode A Space to Connect or Space to Connect. And in this episode, we're probably going to touch on both virtual spaces and in-person spaces. So I'm just going to go straight in there and dive into this. In terms of like vulnerability, we hear this a lot about authenticity, showing up with vulnerability. How does embracing that vulnerability deepen connections in virtual and physical spaces?
I think it's one of the most important things that we can do as facilitators. And actually, from a facilitation perspective, it's something that people don't talk about as much. And often when we facilitate, we think about what we want to get out of the participants that we have in the room. But I'm a big believer that you get back what you give out. And therefore, as a facilitator, it's really important to mirror the way and show that vulnerability yourself. Brené Brown talks about vulnerability, and she talks about it being risk and emotional exposure. And if you think about that, when people are connecting, and especially in that workplace environment, which is the sort of environment that I specialise in, that's really hard. We can't take that for granted because risk and emotional exposure, I mean, there's so much at stake there. But we know that when people do show that vulnerability, it's going to make such a massive difference in the room. So when I'm training people to facilitate, I'm always saying, mirror the way by showing that vulnerability yourself. And there are many ways that you can do that without just throwing your hands up and saying, I don't know what I'm doing. Obviously advocating for people doing that because trust is also really important when it comes to connecting with people effectively. But you can show vulnerability in really simple ways. For example, I do a lot of innovation projects, and I always like to bring into those projects examples from my own history and my own memory of when I've tried things and they haven't worked out or things haven't gone my way. And I weave those stories in. And actually, studies show that when we show we are vulnerable and when we talk about experiences we've had, positive experiences and negative experiences, that actually increases the level of competence people think we have. So vulnerability is risk, but I think it's a risk that really pays off when it comes to making those genuine connections and connecting with people in the right sort of way, especially in the office environment where it's that little bit harder.
Yeah. And I think you're right in terms of like in professional spaces. I think the challenge comes in with people showing up vulnerably. It's like, where's that line where it's too much and too soon? I think it's also something to do with timing, isn't it? And the length
Definitely.
of time that you know these people in the room.
Definitely. And one thing that Brené Brown says that I really like is she says vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability. And I think that's so true. And a lot of that is something that we read quite intuitively in those environments. That's why I really liked when you wrote to me and you said, I think we should call the episode A Space to Connect. I thought that's so great because the way that we connect with people is always defined in a way by the space and how we understand that space, acknowledge that space. There's never, or there shouldn't be, a one-size-fits-all methodology for connecting with other people. The environment is just so important, and we have to read those subtle signs and signals and really think about that proactively before going into a session rather than thinking, well, it will just be the same as it ever was and the same as this workshop I did in the past or the same as it was last week. We can't take those things for granted. We need to plan for those things quite actively.
Yeah, it's very different context and feel and energy depending on where you are. I mean, we're communicating here online on screen, which is very different in person and is very different to outside spaces as well, which is where I spend a lot of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What mental barriers prevent deep connections, and how can we help shift them?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. Let me focus primarily on the workplace environment because otherwise I'll talk too long. But having worked in that environment for a long time, I worked in-house as a facilitator before I moved into consultancy, and I worked with a whole bunch of companies before I worked for myself. That business context is something that is always there, and it's something that we can't ignore. And there's all sorts of barriers that might come with that. And it really depends on what your workplace culture is like. But for example, my background is in insurance. Now, insurance can be very hierarchical. And if you're running a workshop and the CEO is there might be people in that room who really don't want to speak at all. Not all work cultures are like that, but that's something that could get in the way. Another thing that I think is really relevant to the way that we connect and communicate in workplace cultures is this kind of struggle or this fight to be heard. If I come along to a meeting and I see some other people there who have a bit of a reputation for being the loud voices in the room, I may not really engage or listen to what other people are saying because I'm just thinking, okay, I've got my point of view. I already know what that point of view is before the meeting. It's really important for me to communicate X or Y. And I'm sitting in the room, not actively listening to other people because I'm thinking, well, how am I going to get my word in edgeways? And when we think about the balance in the room and this mixture of introversion and extroversion, that might be 50% of our workforce are introverts. Or in some industries, actually, there are more introverts than extroverts on average. And if every session that we have is premised on who shouts the loudest or talks the loudest is the one that gets heard, that is a massive barrier to genuine connection because there's a huge number of people in that room that aren't able to engage properly and connect properly with what other people are saying. They're simply there to fight to get their voices heard. And we lose so much in those types of environments. So that's a common barrier that I see all the time that isn't unique to just a workshop or a training. That's every meeting that we have. That's a potential barrier that gets in the way of that genuine connection.
Yeah. And I think it's really difficult as well when you're combining maybe a more introverted communication style with that virtual space. So it's like, how do you get, like in the physical space, you've got the non-verbals, but in the virtual space, it's even more difficult. And you might even have some people that aren't so confident on the actual platform. So they've got yet another layer of barrier to overcome before they can get their voice heard or their contribution known.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, actually, Lisa, because one thing that I observed, particularly during the pandemic, was everyone's thinking, how do I make my sessions more interactive and inclusive in the virtual environment? Well, let's use Miro or let's use Mural or one of these other tools. And actually, when we do that, we create a whole list of other barriers, which is to do with people's ability to use these tools, So if we don't watch out, we're putting more barriers up. I think in the virtual environment, one thing that I often advise people to do to create that equality in conversation is to make good use of the chat function. That's a really basic functionality of all these types of tools. And it is so useful for balancing the voices in the room because when you put a question out there, you ask people to post some reflections in the chat. It does a couple of things. Firstly, it puts everyone on a level playing field. So people who are more introverted and prefer to think before they speak have the chance to do that. But you also create a space where you, as the facilitator, can make sure that everybody is heard within that session because it gives you the power to say, this time, would you like to share? Would you like to share? And you can sense that balance and actively, control sounds too strong, but you can actively create that balance when you're there in the session. Rather than sometimes what I see is a session starts, and if you don't enforce methods of equality in conversations from the beginning, people would just give up. They'll think, well, the first time it was X and Y that spoke, the second time it was them again. I'm going to stop engaging here because really it's going to be hard for me to put myself out there and get heard. And once people have switched off, that's it. It's very hard to pull that back. So equality from the beginning, I think, is the best way to go about it.
Yeah, I love that, equality from the beginning. Something else popped into my mind as you were speaking around how the facilitator shows up in that virtual space, and how long and how much does the facilitator speak before other voices are heard. Because as an introvert myself, in virtual spaces, I find I can be quite like non-participatory in virtual spaces more so than in person. And I do find like lots of challenges to online spaces. And I find that if a facilitator is starting a session and goes on with the intro, the longer it goes on, the more disengaged I get. And almost like the fear of contributing increases. So that's something that came to my mind. I just wondered if you had any insight into that.
Yeah, that's something that it's a great observation. And oftentimes when people facilitate for the first time, this is one of the key mistakes that they're making. My golden rule is you should have a piece of interaction every 15 minutes to keep people engaged. Now, that doesn't always need to be a massive discussion or a conversation or whatever it is. It could be raise a hand if you've experienced this as well, or give me a nod if what I'm saying makes sense. Those small things make sense as well. But oftentimes the mistake that people make is that they really front load their sessions because they think, well, I've got X and Y pieces of context. Let's say we're looking at designing a new product or automating a process. Well, I need to say everything. I need to give all the context, and actually so-and-so is here and they want to say something and all of these things. And when I see people with sessions weighted like this, my guidance is always bring something in there right at the beginning where people have the chance to contribute and then go into the context. Don't front load it, because if you wait more than 15 minutes to engage with people, they will have already gone and it will be really hard to get them back. If it's a session where, say, it's 10 to 15 people, I always like to invest the time in having a round at the beginning, meaning that I'll ask a question and I'll go to everybody in the group and ask them to contribute. And I think it sets the stage really nicely for people to be aware that in this session, we're going to be sharing the air. And actually, I can relax a little bit knowing that I will be given the opportunities to contribute. I think that's something that makes a big difference when it comes to engagement and participation in our sessions.
I love that. There's 3 key concepts that are coming up for me as you're answering that question there, which is like, be mindful of not front loading, overpacking the beginning before you design something that helps someone contribute in some way, and try to aim for every 15 minutes having some kind of interaction. And then you talked about right at the beginning, I suppose this comes in contracting or setting expectations around saying explicitly that we're going to share the air. I like that term, share the air. Is that a term or phrase that you use in the book, or are there any key phrases that you have in terms of designing those inclusive spaces?
Yeah. So the sort of area of the book we're talking about, I call it navigating the terrain. The metaphor overall here is that facilitating is like being a guide and you're showing people the way through this unknown landscape. And I think getting the right environment is all part of navigating the terrain. It's all about looking ahead, thinking what the obstacles might be and planning for them. One thing that I talk about with this aspect of navigating the terrain is the importance of setting mindsets and intentions up front. I think they should be catchy and memorable, and this is where share the air comes from. It's one of the ones that I use all the time, and I'll say it up front to let people know that we're going to be sharing the air in the session, and it sets that mindset and intention. It's not just reassurance to people, it's also giving them a way to think about how they show up within that session, which is also really important. And I like to do those things right at the beginning, because then if you do end up in a scenario where people aren't bringing the right behaviors to make the whole group feel comfortable and included, it gives you a way to refer back to something in a way that doesn't create that conflict. Because if you're in the session and something's happening and you think, oh no, that's not quite right, I'm going to have to speak out about it, it's so much easier to do that when you've set the stage right at the beginning and you can refer back to it than it is to call someone out for something halfway through that they didn't even realise was something that shouldn't be brought into that session, if that makes sense. I just think these mindsets set us up for success, and they also help us when we do experience the obstacles that we all know are likely to come, because these are dynamic, live environments. That's what brings that emotional exposure and that risk into the setting in the first place.
Yeah. So setting those expectations at the beginning and being very clear on those. So share the air is definitely in there. Are there any other like musts that you would recommend to ensure that you're facilitating some really good connecting spaces?
Yeah, another one that I really like, and I've taken this wording from a facilitator that I used to work with. It's one of my favourite ones. It's digimindful, especially when we're running virtual. Digimindful, yeah, especially when we're interacting in virtual settings. We all know that if you're here and you're talking on your laptop, there's likely to be something around you that's going to be a distraction. Digimindful is about taking a moment to make people aware that's going to be the case and giving them the opportunity to moderate their own environment. This is something that I talk a lot about when I talk about virtual spaces, because oftentimes the assumption is, well, if it's face to face, I can control it. I can set the chairs up in this way. I can make sure there are drinks. I can make sure this and that. And what I always say to people is you can do that in the virtual environment as well. You can make time at the beginning of your session to say, I really think X and Y would help you to get the most out of this. So now's the time to pause your notifications. If you don't have a drink, this is the time to get one. There will be points during the session where I invite you to get up and walk around your space. There'll be times when we have a break and I encourage you to go outside. All of those things are so important, and we often feel like we can't control that in the virtual environment. But what I always say is we can encourage participants to do that for themselves. And that's really what digimindful means to me. That's another one that I love and I use all of the time.
Yeah, I love that. I really do. So, and just being really aware of encouraging, I like the way you're saying encouraging participants to do that themselves, because they're then empowered and invested in making that session as powerful and impactful as it can be. So it's like a team effort rather than one person stipulating all the kind of rules, because we are a bit rebellious when it comes to rules and regulations, especially in a professional context. I think sometimes it's quite nice to just empower people to do it themselves. So yeah, I really like that language. It's nice. So Emily, like with your experience as a facilitator and being on the other end of maybe being in a virtual space or an in-person learning event or experience, when has been a time, if you could share with us, when all these factors came together and you really felt that it was a powerful connecting space?
Sure. So I'd like to pick a hybrid example, because this is something that I get asked about all the time, not just by clients, but also by people that I coach and consult with. They get really worried about hybrid environments. And I think it's that idea that we can connect face to face, we can connect online, but how could we connect when we're doing both at the same time? It feels really difficult. So I ran a session when would it have been now? About 9 months ago, where it needed to be hybrid. We had a team that were going to be there together in the room. And we also had other people from the client's organisation who were based in different countries and wouldn't be able to make it on the day, but should definitely be included. My mindset when it comes to face-to-face virtual hybrid is that we shouldn't see any medium as better than the other. They all have their place and time. And I think going in with that mindset and intention, that whatever you do, regardless of whether it's face-to-face, virtual or hybrid, should be equally as good, forces you to make the decisions that make those into powerful connecting spaces. When it comes to hybrid environments, the key thing is to not make either group feel like they're the one that's being hard done by, right? Often when we run hybrid sessions, we take for granted that the equipment in the room is going to be good enough that people can hear and see us adequately, and that they're going to be able to engage properly with the facilitator. Now, in this scenario, I didn't take either of those things for granted, and I think that's what made it work. So there's a piece of tech called the Owl. I don't know if you've come across the owl before. The owl is like a 360 conferencing software. So you put it in the center of the table and people who are engaging virtually feel like they're in the room. So when conversations are happening, the owl identifies who's talking. You can see them at sort of table level, the same way I'm seeing you now, as if we were talking to each other across a table. You can hear clearly what they're saying. When the participants speak from the virtual setting, they come through just as clearly. And I think that makes a big difference. But the other thing that I would definitely recommend, and I guess this is a bit more accessible if you don't have the money to spend on an expensive piece of kit, get a co-facilitator for the virtual environment so that when you're doing those group activities, you can put the room on mute so they're not listening to a bunch of garbled conversations from the people who are face to face, and have a co-facilitator who's there to run the activity with the people in the virtual setting. And they'll feel then that they're connected. They're connected with each other, and they also have that person who's there to represent them in the main room as well. So they don't feel like their opinions are secondary, and actually they feel like I'm just as much integrated in this, even though I'm not physically present in the room. So I think those two pieces of setup was what made that a great engaging space where people were connecting with each other really nicely.
Yeah, that's really good. I remember like during COVID times, people were being referred to as Zoomies and Roomies.
Yeah.
Did you hear that? Yeah. And it was just like, yeah, being very conscious that the Zoomies, as you say, don't feel inferior at all or hard done by versus the Roomies. And I think that's a really important point that you've made, just making them feel equally important. And
yeah, definitely.
And using a co-facilitator for sure helps that, definitely.
Definitely. I think the best piece of feedback that I ever received on one of my sessions, this is going to sound like a strange thing to say, but it was from a Zoomie. And they wrote to me after the session that I'd run to say, do you know what, Emily, I was planning to use that hour and a half to do my emails and I haven't responded to one. That's the sort of feedback that you want when you're running those types of sessions, particularly hybrid, because I think people who are the Zoomies do often show up expecting that they're not going to be able to hear anything and they're not going to be able to contribute. That's a terrible benchmark.
It just feels like you're going to have to go over so many obstacles in order to be heard, and to be able to make that person not feel that is great, and that you've engaged him enough that he's forgotten about all the other work he has to do. That's brilliant feedback. Yeah, really good. So 3 practical tips then can you offer our listeners if they want to go and create powerful connecting spaces, whether that be online or in real life, in person?
So the first one, we've talked about this quite a lot actually, is the mindset or the intention for the session. This is, in my opinion, so critical. And we've already touched on this a little bit about share the air and digimindful, but try and make it something that people can recall and remember. So 2 or 3 words that you can share with people. Of course, the first time you use it, you're going to explain what it means, but making it catchy means that you can bring it back time and time again in the session when you need to make sure that people continue to connect in that good way. The second thing, and it really comes down to the name of the book, The Path of the Guide. I think facilitation is all about the from and the to. So where are you going from and where do you want to take people to? And just making sure that you communicate that actively throughout the session, that you signpost it. It's so easy when you facilitate something to take it for granted and think, well, I know where we are, so everyone else must do as well. We can't take that for granted. We really need to think about that. And then the final thing, and again, this is something we've talked about, is that equality and turn taking when it comes to conversation. And as I mentioned already, there's some really simple mechanisms that we can use to do that. There's the round technique, asking the question and going to everybody in the room for their opinion before they invite discussion. If you're in a virtual environment, you can use the chat function to moderate the voices in the room, especially at the beginning, as we've discussed. That is just so important to get everybody feeling like they've contributed, that they've been heard, and that they've had equal opportunities. Really comes to the heart of what it means to connect in those sorts of spaces.
Brilliant. Lovely. Really clear. So the first one, mindset and intention, using language that is catchy and that you can keep coming back to and repeat in each session. The examples that you used here was share the air and digimindful. The second point you made was be very clear on the transformation. So where you want to take people from to, and actively signposting this throughout the session. And then the third point you made, equality in turn taking, and some techniques to do that, like the round technique and using the chat function in virtual spaces. That's lovely. They're great practical tips. I just have one last question that I ask all my guests on the Six Comms podcast. Six Comms is founded on the 6 C's of effective communication. And just to remind you and the listeners, they are connection, curiosity and compassion, clarity, customization and consistency. So my last question to you, Emily, is which one of those C's resonates most with you now, and maybe also this topic that we've discussed today?
I really like the mindset of curiosity and talking about curiosity as a skill. It comes in so much to facilitation because I think oftentimes in the workplace we're thinking about what we want to say and what's at stake with what we want to say. And when we behave like that, we forget to be curious about what other people have to add. The whole purpose of facilitation is to allow us to connect better in the workplace, to communicate better, and to effectively collaborate to build things. And I think curiosity is fundamental to all of that because we can't build on something if we don't hear other people's perspective. So I think that curiosity is a really nice C and is something so important to facilitation. That's what I would choose.
Yeah. And I always say that curiosity is the best friend of connection.
It's true. It's definitely true.
Yeah, true. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure and lovely practical tips and insights there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa.